So we have a whole bunch of information in the Crowbar 2 training, and I actually managed to get the video post-produced minimally and uploaded. And so I would ask, if you watch the video, I created a Crowbar sync-in page so that you can actually make time notes to help other people watching the video. So please, please, if you use the video, make notes. And included in that are notes about things to fix in post-production, because it is very easy if people go and give me timestamps to say, hey Rob, there's 5 minutes of garbage on this. Please cut it out between time marker this and time marker that. And that's how we make these videos more useful for other people, because there will be other people following on. It makes us look more professional if the videos are cleaned up. I unfortunately don't have time to watch the 2-hour video again and find every place. So if you can help me like that, it makes a big difference. The other thing I'd like to do is cut it into smaller pieces and figure out the right places. So as you watch it, if you're reviewing it, please make notes and let me know. All right, enough said. And the same will be true with this. Today's, I wanted to start with questions and then slide into actually really going into, this is the data, this object does this object does that, right? Probably starting from the Crowbar YAML and the file layouts, and then actually drilling into actual object discussions and views. So we'll spend some time in code. Sound like a plan? Okay, good. And then same request as last time. Please make notes, comments, and things like that in the Etherpad. It helps if I'm not trying to do the typing. As usual, just interrupt us as we go, and we'll cover it. So I'm going to pull over a GitHub tab. So Victor, you have a thought on what the best place is to start on this? So I don't want to start with the build, because the build stuff really hasn't changed.
Yeah.
So DevTools is pretty much the same. And there is the whole test suite stuff. That's another question. We have whole videos on how to do the testing, the BDD and unit tests. The only note I would have on that is we've pretty much given up on our unit and our spec. We haven't been maintaining those tests. I have.
You've given up on them.
I've given up on them. If somebody else wants to add them, they're still in the suite, but we don't have much coverage there.
Why have you given up on them?
I find them slow, cumbersome, and not very helpful. And so I find that the BDD tests give me a much more complete test. And so I've been focused on that.
People say that about me as well.
Especially the incomplete. Anyway, that's been, I clearly have a bias on it, and if you want to write our spec tests, rock on. I will help make sure that they don't break when I make changes. But I have not been maintaining them.
I think it's useful to have them because with the RSpec tests, we can test things at the level of the models in a much more thorough fashion than I think we can do through BDD.
That's probably true. I completely accept that there are values for unit tests like that. For the time investment I had, I felt like making sure the APIs did the right things and failed in the right ways was the best use of my time. More tests
Hey, Rob,
are better.
I was thinking,
yes?
what might be interesting is if we did a walk through an example of either using the script jig or one of the bar clamps. I haven't looked at the SEP bar clamps and what you've done so far. That would be useful. I don't know if we're ready for that.
No, that's basically where I'm going next. I was going to pick up a bar clamp and walk through its layout so that people can get a feel for what's in it and what the pieces are, and then we'll start digging into that, starting at the Crowbar YAML.
The set bar clamp is actually a pretty good example of that, because one of the things that I did yesterday was I added a fairly complete README to the top level of it. Yeah.
All right, so the Ceph bar clamp.
So Rob, before we head into
Yep. Yeah.
The build process. If we have a Mesa 161 setup right now, can we use the same machine to do a Crowbar 2.0?
Yep.
The package dependencies and
Dev switch development master.
How about
And
the
change, and you have
other
to
dependencies,
check out
like
the other
Ubuntu
cat.
and all that? Is it using 3, 4?
It's using.
It's using the same Ubuntu that everything else uses because by design, that's the only way it works. Oh, you updated that?
I have put the pull request prepped. I haven't done the pull request yet.
Okay.
It'll be done right after.
Yay! All right, I will. That'll override my same one waiting to go. Sooner the better. Yeah. So well, actually, this has been a sort. And once again, please, and we're going to have a community conversation about this. Please weigh in. We're actually talking about a new organization, new top-level org, so that we don't share the same build infrastructure between Crowbar 1 and Crowbar 2.
You mean a GitHub organization?
A new
Yeah.
GitHub organization with
New
fewer.
organization is kind of like,
Sorry, yeah, new GitHub organization. Yeah, I always do that, and I need to be more careful. A new GitHub organization with collapsed repos. So instead of 30 or 40 repos, we'd have, or OpenStack would
Yeah,
probably
because
be
that
one.
repo explosion will get even worse once we start ripping the cookbooks out and putting them in their own repositories.
Assuming that we need to.
Well,
are you going to do that?
I want to do that to make it much easier for us to consume upstream cookbooks. Right now, it's nearly impossible because we have to copy the whole file tree into our repository, which makes it much more of a pain in the ass than it should be to merge changes back in.
So I want to unwind that 3 steps. So one of the goals of Crowbar 2 is to be able to use cookbooks from the community without having to make them so Crowbar-esque that they can't be shared anymore. And so to do that, we actually have to be able to bring in cookbooks from the community without owning them, which means having to put them in repos as an intermediate step. And so we're going to end up probably with Crowbar copies of community repos that track the community repos, but still are forked.
They'll be in our repo, but they'll track the community repos.
That's what I would expect.
Yeah, what wound up happening is we just have a fork on GitHub of all the repos we care about, and set things up so they stay in sync with the upstream to the extent that it's possible.
Well, the challenge is we're going to be ahead. Let's say we do that for OpenStack. We're going to make changes in a cluster that are ahead of what's in the upstream, and then we're going to have to pull from Crowbar to the upstreams. And we still have to work out that process.
Yeah.
Rather than having, and we need to figure that out.
Yeah, there are logistical issues to overcome there.
Because you still have to do the pulls as individuals. So we need to
But
see
having all the
flow
cookbooks
order.
be in their own repos is a big step forward in solving those logistical issues.
And for what it's worth, in OpenStack, all the cookbooks are in a single repo. So there would be a cookbooks repo, there'd be a OpenStack repo, not 40 different repos, but one.
Yeah.
And then a lot of the Crowbar core can collapse too.
We'd want to mirror the structure that we use, because right now we use a lot of cookbooks that were forked off of the original cookbooks, way back in the dark ages. And Opscode's pattern is that each cookbook has its own repository, and that pattern is not true for Stack Force. So we'd want to mirror whatever the upstream's pattern is when we're sucking in cookbooks. But, yeah.
So
we make changes, we make it to our copies, and then we have the merge issues pushing it
and
down.
we still don't know the pattern for that.
Yeah.
It might be that we make
It's a little too early to answer that.
Yeah, we don't. It depends on how the community is going to respond to polls and all sorts of things.
How much customization we have to do. Like, there are a lot of upstream cookbooks that we could basically just use completely unchanged for that. We probably won't even need a staging cookbook. But
If we can
it's
avoid
something we'll have to solve on a case-by-case basis. But enough of that.
But it's worth understanding some of this, and why we're talking about it will come up. Sorry, this is a little washed out. So where to start? So a lot of these things we've tried to keep pretty much the same, but there's definitely some differences. You haven't created the docs directory yet.
I have not. That's because the only thing that I've written is in that README.
So what you'll see here is pretty straightforward layout. Bin is where we've always put binary dependencies, things like that. In this case,
that's just a little, that's an ancient, outdated
it's a whole new
CLI
job.
helper.
So in BIOS and RAID use this considerably, and Glance does because it pre-populates the cache from here. But this is really just riders. The main work is being done in Chef, NoOp. So the next directory here is the jig directory. So in this case, if you drill into Chef, you're going to have all the things the Chef jig would use when it works. And so that comes down to the cookbooks that are used. This is exactly like Crowbar 1, and we just store the cookbooks here.
Well, right now those cookbooks are actually submodule references.
Ah, okay, so they're not even in here. They're just, they just pull directly off the community cookbooks, right?
And that's mainly because submodules are so evil that that's going to be more of an impetuous to actually have a real solution to the cookbook story.
Submodules, for people who aren't used to Git, are basically reference pointers to another GitHub repository. So this allows, Victor didn't actually write the cookbooks. He just used the ones that were out there and then morphed and then drove them with Crowbar, which makes them a really good example.
So go ahead and drill into the cookbooks there. For instance, here, the Apache 2 cookbook, completely unchanged. That's ops code. It's Apache 2 cookbook. The Ceph cookbook, is a fork of the upstream Ceph cookbook that I have Crowbar 2 eyes.
Okay, so you did actually make some custom Crowbar.
Yeah, I made a fair amount of customization to that, but that is just a few commits on top of the upstream Ceph cookbook.
So if the upstream one changes, how do we have a mechanism in place for notification and data bounce?
Merge and rebase.
Notification, we don't have a notification.
There is no notification scheme. We would just, and that's one of the things that we'd have to address is how to do that. Because Git doesn't help you out really there at all.
And that's the trick with the submodules. The submodules are tied to a specific commit, so you don't automatically track the upstreams.
Yeah, I mean, there are ways to do it. Like we could require that everyone that works on a cookbook have remotes that track both our fork and the upstream fork, and then they'll notice when things are different.
No, but let's hold on on this topic because we could spend an hour talking about it, and nobody would be any better educated on Crowbar 2. Let's see, find the right way. There. All right, so the trick is
back out of there.
There's the cookbooks. Roles are really where it gets interesting.
Roles are what we maintain.
Right. So these are the roles that this list is required, and it's the list of roles that Crowbar 2 uses to run the orchestration. And then inside of these roles is a template. And the template file is what's used to set the defaults. So where you're used to having data bags in the Chef recipes, and this was literally the network JSON was one of these. Every Barclamp had its own. We've split them based on roles. They were already split based on roles, but there was only one data bag per Barclamp. Now there's effectively a data bag per role.
Yeah, but it's not used as a data bag because these templates should be able to apply to anything that we drive with the jig.
Yes, distinctly not a data bag. It's distinctly Crowbar
it's actually,
metadata.
From a Crowbar 2 standpoint, this is actually an attribute or two.
Mm-hmm.
So Chef defines roles, and then we have roles outside Chef. And that is a Crowbar role, and those are different. Is it?
Yes, although in this case they kind of map directly one on top of another.
Okay. But we start using Puppet.
They would have different contextual meaning in Puppet or Salt or something else. Because we're focused on Chef, we happily create an alignment.
What is OSD?
OSD is essentially a storage device in Chef.
Object storage, data storage.
Yeah.
It's a Ceph thing.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a Ceph thing. The naming matches Ceph's naming for it.
Okay.
And so this is the list of components for roles that we set up. And basically, the only thing you're going to find in the role are these.
The bare minimum that we have to have: name, description, round list.
These are these are the role RBs are the chef are the actual role files necessary for Ceph, and if there's metadata required, we create the template as a directory underneath.
Are there going to be multiple metadata files in that directory?
No.
Yeah, so we could probably optimize this back a level if we wanted to.
We probably could, but I'd just stick with what we have for now until we find a solid use case for having more than one.
Right. In the original designs, there were actually 2 metadata files in each one, and we realized that was silly, and now there's only 1. And so that's why we had originally there were 2. There was one for the role data and one for the deployment role data, which is the template default plus the node specific, and it's actually the same information. So we only have one.
And so there's actually another role under the no-op directory, which is role information for the no-op jig.
So this is really significant. The no-op jig has different roles in it than the chef jig. So we have 2 different roles, and we have multiple roles implemented by this bar clamp, executed by different jigs.
Yeah.
Okay.
What does the no-op jig do?
Nothing.
Why do we need it?
Because it makes a very useful synchronization point for whenever we want to force certain actions in the node role state graph to kind of align, to act as a breakpoint, and just as a general target for other things to look at.
So, for example, if you wanted to deploy Ceph, if OpenStack wants to use Ceph, it would bind to the no-op role. And then the no-op role would make sure that all of the prereqs were installed. That way the downstream consumer doesn't have to worry about all of the details inside of the service.
And pretty much and the other thing the no-op does, the no-op jig still has the same attribute semantics as the rest of the jigs do. So like, for example, in the role template here, the Ceph config provides certain metadata that has to be consistent across the entire cluster, like what the name of the cluster is and what its UUID is. The cluster name is default always going to be Ceph, unless you change it to something else here, and so we'll see where the UUID gets injected later.
And we can write an override screen so that when you set up, you can actually modify this and change it and then have it be reflected in the deployment.
Yeah, those screens are already there, I think.
But it's important to understand that because we do use the no-op jig in deployments, and one of the things you'll need to do to build a good Crowbar 2 cookbook is probably, especially like an OpenStack, you'll probably need to use some no-op roles. So the Crowbar engine is actually the app, is the actual UI overlays and things like that, and the model definitions. So there's 2. I'm going to hold off on going into this for a minute, because I wanted to go to the Crowbar YAML next. The other stuff is Git. README is where Victor has the docs are for now, and then we're going to remorph that into the /docs directory. And so all the READMEs in the system have been changed.
I'm going to argue with you still about that.
You can argue. Have been changed to point people to the docs directories, and then we'll explain how the docs. We've actually had a lot of training already on how the docs stuff works. We've tried to simplify this considerably, although a lot of it still stays the same. So this is all metadata for the bar clamp. So when you import a bar clamp, still use the same process. That's not true. When a bar clamp, no, it is true. When a bar clamp is imported, it's created with a lot of with this information. We've been trying to update these to API and which operating systems this bar clamp will run on. And then this is the new area. So inside of the metadata, instead of all the order components, there's actually a roles list. And so inside the role, you actually identify, this is the definitive list of the roles.
The statically created roles. You can dynamically create them too, but that's a separate topic.
That's true. You can. So these are the ones that are created up front, and so you identify a role's name, which jig implements it, and then its dependencies. So in this case, you're going to see the Ceph config role requires network Ceph and Crowbar installed node. Crowbar installed node is also a placeholder that says everything is ready to go on this node.
Yeah.
So isn't the jig also sort of like a dependency?
The jig is a dependency, and it's handled as such.
Right.
The machinery for doing it's a little separate from how the role machinery is handled, because like the jig or the no-op jig doesn't have anything backing it. Neither really does the script jig, but like the chef jig, anything that depends on the chef jig also has an implicit dependency on the chef client being installed on that node. And so, yeah, there is a dependency backup through the jigs, and it's actually handled through pretty much the same annealing mechanism that we use for everything else.
So jigs are provided by bar clamps.
Yes.
And so you could name a jig in this configuration file that was provided by some other bar clamp than the one that's file.
Yeah, like the no-op jig is provided by the Crowbar bar clamp.
And
the chef jig is provided by the chef bar clamp.
And we will take on faith that that jig exists until you
the point
actually
where we need it.
until you actually go to use the role.
And it has to be deployed before this.
It doesn't have to be. It has to be deployed before you use the role. This is the late binding aspect, but it doesn't have to be deployed when you import the bar clamp. So you can import a bar clamp that depends on the foo jig with no foo jig in your system. That will work. But if you try and use the role that depends on the foo jig, it will fail, because it's entirely possible. So here's the use case. I could actually have Puppet or Chef logic working in this jig, in this bar clamp, and have both roles that support both, but never install the Puppet jig. And we don't want the bar clamp import to fail. It should only fail if you try to use roles that it can't implement. So that's the failure point we pushed back as far as we possibly could.
Now, I noted, and Vic told me earlier, that roles have, by convention, their providing bar clamp name in them.
Yeah.
Jigs do not.
Yeah, like all the role names, like it's like Ceph config, network Ceph, all that other junk. Yeah.
That's just a convention, but yes. Our convention.
I think we might be enforcing it right now, but we might be enforcing it at bar clamp.
So the question is, would that be equally useful for jig names too?
I didn't see the use when I was creating it, quite honestly.
It'll. As a matter of fact, once
don't
you've
expect
imported
most
a
bar
jig,
clamps
we don't know which bar clamp it came from.
Yeah, we do.
I don't think it tells you.
Yeah, there's a separate jigs stanza that declares what jigs the bar clamp imports.
I don't think the database tracks it.
The database might not, but we can figure it out.
So, and we'll see this. These are great questions.
That's why we're doing this.
Yeah, I mean, this is the problem. Victor and I are so deep in this. There's things that we don't know to tell you. If you don't ask questions, we will gloss over it.
Is it possible to be able to walk through this from beginning to end? So, for example, setting up a node and just going through each one of the steps and exactly what's going on, what's being called. It'd be nice if it even failed, where it would be written, those types of things.
We will build up to that point. Right now, as soon as I start that process, you're going to be asking the question. You're going to be here's the problem. You're going to be asking the questions I'm answering that you didn't know you needed to know yet.
Okay.
So it makes sense to take a workflow approach to this once we've given you once we've built up enough of the basics.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think I did a basic walkthrough of what happens when you discover a node on the mailing list like a few months ago.
You did.
It'd probably be a good idea to bring it up to date.
Yeah, I'm thinking this is more of like a dev demo for the design, and that I think QA and some of the other people are looking more for a admin use case scenario type of demo.
I understand.
Okay, so maybe, yeah. afterwards.
And this is, yeah, we have different paradigms, multiple audience. So
Okay.
hang with
No
us.
Yep.
Okay, so what you're going to get is the requirement list. And once again, this is late bound. So you can create requirements for a role, for roles that don't exist yet in the system, and might not exist in any bar clamp you import, but are, it's a tricky chair.
Yeah.
But are created dynamically. So
a perfect example, if you scroll back up a tiny bit,
sure,
is Ceph config depends on the network Ceph role, which isn't imported by any bar clamp, and you have to create it first before you can deploy Ceph.
Right. And we need to talk about how it knows to create those.
Yeah.
So, oh no, you actually, in this case, you actually have to create it for it, right?
Or it'll die. That's why I want the 500 screen to be.
Yeah.
So that I can say you didn't create the network Ceph bar clamp, stupid.
But the definition of that.
If you use the default config and then all of a sudden you change it, can you reapply it? And will it work or?
I'm sorry. Use the default config for what?
No, he's asking if you modify the configs.
It requires the Ceph config. So you go into Ceph config, you make some changes. The config does exist. Will it try to deploy the new configuration parameters, or will it?
Yes. Yeah. If you change the parameters of a role for a node, and it will. That's a base. You can only do that as a proposal. And once you're done making the edits, you commit the proposal, and then it re-anneals it.
Well, to be fair, the only thing you can change when you're editing a role or a deployment role template or a node role template in proposed state, you can only change the attributes. You cannot change the dependencies. The dependencies are more or less completely hardwired.
Correct.
The only way you can change them is to import the bar clamp again with different dependencies. And quite frankly, yeah, we don't want to even try to.
We haven't gone there yet.
That will break things quite horribly right now. So don't do that.
We're in the same state we are here that we were in Crowbar 1, where it's not recommended.
So it's not recommended to change the dependency graph of a deployment after you've imported it and started using it.
Okay.
If you haven't used it, we haven't touched it yet.
Well, in Crowbar 1, it was actually worse in that there was no dependency graph at all.
But
yes,
yes,
ad hoc.
our benchmark for a lot of features is this equal or slightly better than Crowbar 1? And if the answer was yes, we moved on. And so we did.
We're not trying to engineer a perfect system here.
We did not engineer a lot of teardowns or dynamic changes and things like that.
No, and that's fine. I was just trying to understand where the problems may occur, or where other people may think they can do things that really won't work right.
Right, and one of the things you'll notice in the UI, we have not in any way exposed editing tools for these things. So the UI lets you change surprisingly little, and the reason is that you shouldn't change those things yet.
Yeah.
Okay.
We won't let you change them until we have a good story to make sure your changes are sane.
So this is a really significant improvement over what we did in Crowbar 1, where we hoped that we got the orders right and the dependencies right. It is incredibly explicit with Crowbar 2. You have a very defined node graph. The thing that's important to understand is we don't actually test it. Test is the wrong word. We don't actually use it to create the relationships until you actually go and you actually create the node roles. So we try to do that as late as possible. So from that perspective, if you can change things up until the time you start building a deployment on them.
That kind of brings up another question. What if afterwards somebody goes in and decides they want to manually change a parameter? Not here, but from the command line, API, whatever it may be.
Well, when you're talking about
what
changing,
happens at that point?
when you talk about changing parameters, you're talking about attributes.
Yeah.
And we'll let you change those all day long. That's not a problem. Whether or not your changes are same, that's your own lookout.
Right.
Now, will we automatically go back in and rewrite those, or just leave it the way it is?
Well, if you change them and they're changed, I mean, I don't understand what you're driving at there.
Well, I'm just wondering. People like to go in and poke around.
Yeah.
Change things because they think something should be better, and it doesn't coincide with the configuration that was originally set.
I'm afraid I would need a specific answer to give you a specific question to give you a good answer.
Let's hold off on that, because I think what you're asking for are things that are in scope and work as far as how we change deployment configuration, which is it's different. What we're really describing now is the high level how a configuration is interconnected and laid out, which is different than the turning the knobs of a configuration. Okay. So the way I like to think of these roles is as services. And so in open, like if you're bringing up a Hadoop system, you're going to bring up trying to think of the
you need your master and secondary nodes. You need all your HDFS nodes.
Edge node. There's roles on the edge node that you need to have done.
Your pig, your zookeeper, your hive, your whatever else.
So every service within Hadoop would be a role. Just like, we already have this. We had this in the original bar clamp. We had a bar clamp for each one originally, right? Where in the past we had a bar clamp with 1 or 2 roles in it. That you're more likely to create Hadoop as a master thing with each service.
Just a single bar clamp with a bunch of roles in it.
Right. The old Crowbar 1 design, you might have actually split Ceph into 3 things, but I would discourage that today. And then this is what you're used to seeing. This is the dependency graph where we actually pull in and pre-populate the caches.
The packages that you need.
And this is dead. You don't need this at all.
Oh, good. I'll kill it then.
Okay. There is no localization file in Crowbar YAML. Those things should die.
That's its own. That's all. That should be handled in the en.yaml these days.
Exactly. Okay. So that actually brings us to the engine. So one of the things that we did way back, actually just before we stopped, we really completed this work, is we broke Crowbar into a framework piece, which is in the bar clamp Crowbar right now, and all of the bar clamps are Rails engines, which means that they're actually their own namespaces underneath of the Crowbar framework. And that gives them a fair bit of autonomy in how things work. It changes some of the programming slightly, but not too much. The thing to understand is that every time you create a bar clamp, you've created a namespace. And when you extend the roles or the jig or
if you have to maintain your own database tables.
Or the attributes, right? Yeah. Or you have your own schema additions. Those are actually handled underneath these engines. So what you have here in a bar clamp is you have an engine. So bar clamp Ceph has an engine. Inside that engine, you could have multiple. We only expect you right now to have one. So bar clamp Ceph is the engine. So it's the namespace that Rails is going to use for all of the code inside of this. And for the most part, this is pretty empty. What you're going to find in here...
You need the gem file. You may have to manually add things.
Right. If you need gems specific for your code.
Yeah, like I think the only one that adds something specific right now is the chef bar clamp, and it adds the chef gems. So that I'm not interacting with knife all the time.
And then underneath this, you've got, just like before, we talked about this, so I'll bring it up. You didn't do any localizations. Okay.
Nope.
So if you had localizations, you would put them, because you didn't do any UI work yet.
Nope.
If you had localizations, you'd actually put them under here in localizations. So you'd actually put locales and then the locale for your anything specific that you needed in your bar clamp. So if you do UI work, you're going to put that here. And then the interesting stuff starts coming into the app. So in here is where you actually have controllers, models, and views. To if you extend the API, you're going to need a controller for it. These are
standard.
Yeah, I don't think they shouldn't have anything in them. As a matter of fact,
yeah, they have.
That's old. This is, you don't have a service object anymore.
Right, well, that's it's whatever the create
had?
engine script.
Okay. Yeah, so we need to revisit the create engine script because some of this stuff is unnecessary. This is empty. It's a placeholder.
I think we require that class exists. We just don't require that it do anything.
Yeah. There's a couple of things that are overrides like that.
Yeah, it just preserved the old code inside newly named files in order to show that here's the place you will add new code.
And so what we probably want to do is go back and look at those
That's
scripts.
the service object code.
Depending on how much we need to migrate, I actually suspect we're not going to migrate that many bar clamps. So we'll think about that. At the time, the deltas between 1 and 2 were smaller, and I think as we've gotten further along, the deltas have gotten a little bit bigger. So assets, if you're not used to Rails 3, assets is where you keep JavaScripts and style sheets and things like that, as opposed to public, which is where they were in Crowbar in Rails 2. So it's a Rails 3-ism.
Most bar clamps probably won't need their own assets at all.
Correct. If they add style sheets, we might, but like if we reskin it, that would be likely where it is. They also probably don't need helpers. Helpers are basically global code for the UI. Okay. Models are the place where we actually have most of the action that you would need. You can write a bar clamp without doing models, but if you want to do any of the overrides or changes, then you'll definitely need to change the models.
Generally, if you have schema associated with bar clamp, that's through the models.
You definitely need a model.
Yeah, you definitely need a model then, but you also need a model if you're doing like all the models here are actually the subclass role, and they exist so I can do so I can customize the behavior of any given role. Like we're looking at the mon, all the mons they need some custom behavior, and this is where you implement it.
Right. So the way this is designed, roles and node roles are really central to this. And what happens is if you define a node role, if you want to override the default behavior for a role, you create a class with the name of that role. So in this case, barclamp cephmon implements the cephmon behavior
on the framework side.
On the framework side. So. And what this example does, the test barclamp actually exercises a lot of these too, and has examples that are more stubs rather than actually working things. So you can use those as examples also. So what happens is every role has there's a series of and they're not exactly events.
They're more hooks.
They're hooks. That get called depending on state transitions on the node role. So as the node role goes through its various states, it will call these hooks. And there's some additional hooks that we created at different points as we've needed them. In this case, when a deployment is created, this would be a deployment.
This is a deployment role. Yeah.
And it's worth. Let me explain something. What we mean by deployment role. Boy. You want to try? Or you want me to do it?
So roles, you saw when we were talking about roles that you can have a role template.json. That's global. That's what the default setting for the role is going to be anytime it's deployed.
It's scope to a deployment is
no. I'm talking about the global default role.
Okay.
Yeah. The global role template. What the deployment role is a little class that essentially inherits everything from the role, including that global template that is bound to a specific deployment that you can then go in and customize so that every instantiation of that role in a deployment inherits from the deployment role instead of the global one.
Right. And then when you create a node role, it gets scoped down to the node level. So it's really, think of it as a scoping boundary. Node is scoped global, or role is a global scope. A deployment role is a deployment scope for that role. And a node role is a node scope for that role.
So if you define a number of different deployment roles, how do you choose between them?
There's only one per role in each deployment. So a deployment only has one instance of any role, and thus only the deployment role is actually the binding point for that.
Okay.
So
let me try to restate. I may have got this asked about first. If I'm rolling stuff out to say 3 different environments, which all have their own unique requirements. I still want the same role to go to each one, but I want it to be deployed differently.
Yep, that's what this is
that's a
for.
deployment role.
So, as a user, how do I select that deployment role to deploy to that environment?
Go into the deployment, add the role to it, and it'll pop up in the little grid view that we saw yesterday. Click on the role name in that grid view, and you'll be editing the deployment role to
the top of the column. If you click that, it takes you to the deployment role, and you can configure it for that deployment. It doesn't take you to the role; it takes you to the deployment role.
But sorry, I thought you said you had to configure it through that.
This is default behavior for a deployment role. Like the reason that we have a non-deployment create here is because if you're creating a new Ceph cluster, you're creating it in a deployment.
Yes.
And every monitor in that deployment needs to have the same secret key. And so, perfect place to add it. If you want to override it, you can before you do any, before you commit the node role, or before you commit anything that you create.
Wind back. You're now telling me there's 2 ways to modify the behavior of deployment. You can either do it through.
This is what the framework will do. That secret key is required. Ceph won't deploy without it, so we have to have one.
That's fine.
There aren't 2 ways for you to modify it.
There's a way for the framework to modify it and a way for you to modify it, and we use that pattern a lot.
So at transition points, when you add a role, when you connect a role in a node, or when you add a role to a deployment, right? It's going to make sure that there is a deployment role, and at that point, it's going to invoke this code to make sure that the prerequisites are met for that role to be attached to the deployment.
So where in that sequence do you modify the deployment?
That a user would modify after this. It would be after this ran.
Right.
So the framework gets in, does its stuff, and then it becomes available for a user to modify.
Yes. Although,
and the framework will never touch that again unless you delete everything and start from scratch.
For deployment roles.
Yeah.
And for so one of the things that we've done with this node deployment roles are basically template data that's going to be the default template data that's shared for everybody else. And we do things like when you create a new network, it creates an IP. If it's an automatically created IPv6 owner, it'll create an IPv6 domain header.
It'll create a prefix.
Yeah.
Okay, so if I'm sorry to harp on this, but it's something I'm either not understanding or I'm missing. So if I've got my 6 deployments I want to do, 6 environments I want to populate.
Totally right.
For one role, whichever it is, I want 3 of them to be that layout, and 3 of them to be this layout, whatever that is. Does that mean I then have to manually modify all 6 deployment roles?
If you have 6 deployments, you would have to manually configure each of them. Eventually
that's massively error prone.
We have within the scope of Crowbar 2 the idea to have nested deployments so that you could have 2 deployments that are different and then children from them so you don't have to reconfigure things.
Yeah,
we're not there yet.
And you also have to remember that a lot of this is infrastructure that automation tools would be built on top of.
But no, you're asking the right question, and that's a future function. But we've definitely imagined a deployment tree. It just gets really complex. as you know. But this pattern is really indicative of what happens. So we found that we really needed to provide hooks so that when transitions occurred, you could do the right. There were times when Crowbar had to do the right thing as a prep, or as a check to make sure that we didn't continue. Like, so sometimes we could throw an error if conditions weren't met. So this is one example, and then every time a node role changes state, you can also create hooks. So when it's created or when it's transitioned, when it's committed or errored or active, any of those state changes have default behavior that you can override if you want. There's a ton of, we haven't overridden, we only have a few overrides in the system, but the hooks are there to provide that case. It's very important to understand these hooks are synchronous. So when you make these changes, they happen within the not within the transaction boundaries. That was actually a discussion we had. But they happen in line with the code. So everything is blocked.
They
while
will
these
delay
hooks file.
your API call or whatever.
So will the UI get frozen or something? Or?
If you do a lengthy
Well, so it depends on what you're doing. If you're doing a lengthy operation that doesn't go through the annealer, so
You don't want to do lengthy operations that don't go through the annealer.
Right. The annealer, if you want a lengthy operation, that is an annealer.
It should
operation.
be at that point. If you want to do something lengthy, that should be its own role.
Right. This is the contract, and this is a really important thing to understand. And Wayne's.
I still don't understand what you meant by synchronous. For all these, you say all these hooks are synchronous.
Yes.
What does that mean?
They're blocking.
Okay. With regard to all the other hooks, or the hooks of a particular kind?
With regard to a specific API call.
Yes. They're not blocking universal.
Let's say that again. With respect to a particular kind of hook, or all hooks?
The hooks
to a call.
Okay, so
call doesn't mean anything to me.
Okay. You make a REST call into it. Framework does something. Get back data. Hooks happen synchronously within that boundary. They aren't scheduled for. They don't have an event framework. They don't schedule callbacks to complete at some time in the future after that API call is finished.
Right.
That's all we need.
They must be executed.
And I'm asking, with respect to. So within a single API call, won't multiple hooks perhaps be invoked?
Yeah,
potentially.
Okay, are they synchronous with respect to each other?
They're in line.
They are in line.
They're executed in order.
They're executed in whatever order the code says they should be executed in.
But they're not executed simultaneously.
No.
And it doesn't matter what kind of hook it is. It can't be executed simultaneously with any other hook.
With any other hook in that API call. That is correct.
Yes. Now you could have you have multiple threads.
Don't complicate things.
All right.
This is very important. I think this is an architectural feature that can be described in documentation.
Yes, I have described it in documentation.
Excellent.
Or at least in long emails that should be turned into documentation if they haven't already.
I'm still working through it.
Yeah.
And they're documented.
Yeah.
It's just that we're talking about them, synchronous and everything, and that means different things in different contexts.
It totally does, and that's why I'm drilling on it, because I want people to understand which context we're using, right? Because the node roles are annealed in parallel, and those events that spark these things happen in parallel. But within the context of that one node role doing its thing, these are part of that run. Okay, so they don't get called. So the reason I'm trying to be so
we do have
on
multiple threads of control, and we are running in a multi-threaded, multi-process environment. So that's why you see a crap load of transactions in here to make sure that information gets shared at the appropriate points.
Right. But we've attempted not to block things, as little blocking as possible.
Yeah.
Those are death.
So that's a clue when you see the transactions that this code is synchronous.
it's not so much that the code is synchronous, is that either everything happens or nothing happens in there, and anything else that's respecting will never see inconsistent data that happens inside that transaction boundary.
We've been, because we have the benefit of a database, we have bundled quite a bit of activity inside transactions.
Yes.
Which is good.
Our database is very good at doing transactions, so we leverage it to the hilt.
So we've drilled on this an awful lot. The reason is because it's prototypical of other types of places we catch model transitions and then take action. Nodes being created in the system is another good example. So when nodes are created, there's jigs get informed about that, and with an on node create.
Or roles get informed of that.
And roles get informed also. So there's a lot of places where we follow this pattern. And we've been trying to document them in the model docs and capture that information so you have it. If you see one of these, please make sure it's documented in the model's description so that people know how to extend it. These are extension points. Actually, these are the primary extension points. So as you're playing with anything complex in a deployment, this is what you will, most of the code you're going to write to make a Crowbar deployment interesting is in here. System data is the other thing that you're very likely to touch, and it's the handoff point between Crowbar and the jig.
Yeah. Sysdata is essentially data that the Crowbar framework is in charge of providing to a jig. There's a separation between data that the user provides to a jig and data that the Crowbar framework provides to a jig and data that the jig hands back to the Crowbar framework. We keep those separate, we store them separately, and there are rules that determine how they all get smashed together whenever we need to do a jig run on something.
You said the word user.
Yes.
Who is that?
Mm-hmm. The admin or whoever's making choices outside of the Crowbar framework.
Okay.
And so that ends up being something that the system can do for you, but we end up needing places where you touch it and mess with it.
Yeah.
This is where I wanted to bring up that a node roles are a central thing in Crowbar 2, has I think 4 different types.
Well, from
of
here,
data.
go ahead and bring up the model.
Okay. Let's see. Sorry.
Yeah. Good enough.
I don't think I have it.
Master, it's not app, it's Crowbar framework. You just go with master.
Mm-hmm. So you want me to do it at the model or at the database? Because the models.
Well, from the model, we'll have the attribute whatevers.
Should. Node role. Yay, node roles. All right. They're not actually done. They're actually overridden. Is the trick.
Yeah.
So right. So I'm going to skip over the states for a second. So node roles have basically 4 different types of data that they preserve. And if you remember back in the Crowbar 2 debates, we actually have a lot of discussions about inbound data and outbound data and wall data. Those are in Crowbar 2 Crowbar 2 current. Those are all discrete ways we keep data. So there is data here called user data. The user data is what is the outbound data that the user describes. Pretty straightforward. There is system data, which is data that the Crowbar pushes down as part of the configuration. So it's also outbound data. And then wall data is data that comes back. It's inbound data from the node from the jig about deployments. Does that make sense? So, and we have the concept of wall already.
Wall data?
Because it's analogous to the old Crowbar wall section in Crowbar 1.
Yes.
That's it.
Well,
There's no deeper reason.
It could be incoming data or inbound data or something that actually means something as opposed to.
It could be.
When you're being logical again. Ouch. Oh.
How dare you question our conventions?
Imply more than.
No.
This Pink Floyd reference?
Old school back when Unix systems were actually multi-user. Yeah. When the admin wanted to annoy everyone.
It's a Facebook reference.
Too old school.
Yeah, very old school. So yeah, Wayne, I understand.
No,
But that's the inbound.
it does. Okay, that's it.
That's inbound. Yeah, and we actually at one point had it called like sys inbound and sys out or something like that. And the reality is that in and out are incredibly confusing to people in description, and we found in and out to be even worse, frankly, than having to understand the term wall. Let's put it this way: we had disagreements where we were actually talking about the same thing and didn't realize it when we were using inbound and outbound.
Yeah.
And that one of the things that we want to ultimately do but don't do right now is have schema validations. But we don't.
Well, when we refactor some of this stuff to be more attribute driven, that'll probably just fall out naturally.
Yes. All right. So that's the key thing. And then the fourth type of data, for those of you keeping track of the numbers, the fourth type of data is inbound data on the node. And we actually keep the OHI discovered data on the node, not on the node roles, as it's actually node.discovery. So that data is actually read-only retrieval data, and it's treated separately because it's really global for the node. It's not specific for the node role. Everything else is node role specific. And that's what happened to that. So one of the big things we used to talk about a lot was the inbound data, displaying it on the UI. That's stuffed on the node because it was effectively read-only information. And it made more, otherwise you'd have to aggregate it, and that was a mess. Okay. Yes. Right off. Judd, your comment doesn't make sense to me.
Oh, he's kicking it old school Unix admin style. Ignore him.
Did anybody set up something for Judd to be able to see the screen?
Judd doesn't need to see.
Okay, thank you, Chris.
It just absorbs.
This absorbs the code right through his fingers.
Runs it through SED and.
So today the node role stuff actually has a state machine, right? We said this a couple times. Node role is the state thing. It's the state machine thing. We showed that yesterday.
It's the primary driver of all state in the cluster.
And so here's the states that we track for them. And then these actually, in the UI, these all get localized, but these fixed strings are actually useful if you need to use them.
Are these the only ones?
Those are the only states.
And we snapshot for every state transition?
No, God no.
For every deployment commit is effectively a snapshot created.
Yeah.
And we actually do our best to hide the fact that there are snapshots in the system, because
Why?
Eventually we want to expose them, but for right now we find them confusing.
You mean exposed in the UI?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, when you said hide, you mean hide from the user.
Hide from users. Hide from users. And to an extent, when you deal with a deployment, there's a deployment.head, because snapshots are a linked list. Most of the action that you do is against the deployment.head, and you never refer to a snapshot individually. You'll see if you actually look at the URLs, we actually use the snapshot. There's a lot of displays for deployments that are based on snapshot, but it's always by default showing you the head snapshot.
Why is it necessary to actually separately define the ordinal values versus what their named values are? Like that?
It actually ends up being a UIism.
Oh, okay.
Because Ruby doesn't have support for enums, that's why.
That's another good reason.
I guess that was probably an easier question for me to ask. Okay.
So we use the top level, the top ones, and there's a couple places where the UI wanted to have these states come in like that. That really is a UIism.
Well, because that way all the numeric stuff also falls out as a constant, and you can refer to it as such from anywhere.
Yeah, it's really a states array, and then these guys are cross-references. One of the things that's a little bit, it's actually worth explaining this to an extent. So node roles are the core. When you ask what the state of a deployment is, there is no such well, there's a small version of the concept, but predominantly a deployment state is its node role aggregate state. And a node's state is its node role aggregate state. So there is no such thing as saying a node is ready or active or to do. What it really is a node, if you ask for a node state, it goes to its node roles. It's node roles.
If they're all active, then it's active. And if them are an error,
Well,
then it's an error.
is there a way of, is there a simple representation of what you just said?
Yes. So you can go to a role.
But it's not that.
This is because this is node role. If I go to node and look at node.state, what it's actually doing is it's going through and
computing it right there.
It's computing it.
Okay.
And so it doesn't have actually the nuance of all the substates. So basically, we collapse to do, blocked, and transition into one thing.
And can you interrogate that result for more detail?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can get the list of node roles that are on that node, and then take action on it, and then inspect it to get details.
One can compute, but there's not a method that you can call.
Yeah, no, there's an API. There's an API call, and then you can actually get node.node roles, and it would return all those to you.
Right, you're returning all this stuff, and then you have to pick out the state of each individual node.
Yes.
For now.
I actually
different thing than what I was saying.
Yeah, and actually no. There's something actually a little bit more. There's a status piece which is a little bit smarter than that, where it actually picks out the error ones.
Okay.
So sort of.
Yeah. Right. Sorry, I didn't mean
We haven't made that thing query.
We haven't needed it. It just hasn't been a need yet. Lots of gaps and edges.
We have this thing where we don't actually implement something until there's a demonstrated need for it.
Yes. And if we find each other varying from that, we usually hit each other.
Yeah.
Okay. So we talked about node role. That's really the central thing. And then let's look at role. Oh, okay. Yeah, and then we'll look at script jig for a little bit. Oh, perfect. So if you look at the roles, okay. One thing I should point out is Rails 3 is trying to get rid of the find, where, blah, and blah type queries. They're trying to make that go away. They're replacing it with this word scope. So what you would do is you would have, this replaces the find bys. So you define a scope and then you can use it. And the idea is
you can chain them together when you're doing calls, and it actually ends up looking a lot nicer than the find blah 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 blah.
Right. It's also much more maintainable because then you're not doing random SQL joins everywhere in the code. You're doing them in a single block. And it's easier to maintain.
Yeah. And when you chain them together, Rails on the back end actually goes in and generates a single SQL call that chains them all together.
It's pretty smart. So do not use find by blah and blah and blah. Create scopes or use the scopes we defined.
And if you looked at node role, you notice I have created a lot of scopes
Yeah, there's a lot.
to cover the various things we look
You've got
at.
a shiny new toy and we're playing.
No,
It actually
they're
makes-
really deprecating fine.
It actually makes things a fair amount more readable.
Name scope was the same thing in those two. I mean,
Yes, but now you can create scopes for anything.
understood. I'm just saying, it wasn't like there wasn't scope.
Correct. Yeah, this isn't. Yeah, this is. But they're specifically trying to deprecate the other way of doing it. So trying to be good citizens with our Rails. So here's a really interesting, or here's an example. So in roll, this is where we have all the stubs for the calls that would be called, and you can override it. And so if you don't override it, when the hooks. So what you'll actually get is this. We'll actually log that you didn't override the hooks for any roll.
So, are they overrides or hooks? Because hooks typically aren't necessarily overrides.
Considering
hooks are aggregated as opposed to overrides.
well,
But these are overrides.
These
Okay.
yeah, I mean, the difference is kind of moot here in that these are only ever called. A node roll is only ever bound to one roll, and so you're only ever going to call the hook on one roll at a time.
They're really overrides, and they're called when that node roll is acted on. This method is always called,
Gotcha.
and you can override.
If one was going to subclass the roll, you still only call one.
Yes.
Okay.
And here's one of the things that we've done is you can subclass at the roll level, and you can also subclass a roll at the bar clamp level. So if you have a bar clamp that provides generic, that you want all the things in the bar clamp to provide certain behavior, like the network actually does this.
Yeah.
Then you can actually override. You can say any network role, because remember, network roles are dynamically created, so we can't create subclasses for them. At the network bar clamp level, there is a generic role that we use for dynamically created bar clamps.
Or dynamically created network roles.
No, sorry, dynamically created network roles. That overrides these in a generic way that any network role can handle. And then we also, to make that work, we had to override, there's one network role that is not dynamically created, and that one actually has a defined role override so that it's used instead of the deployment level, the top level one, if that makes sense.
I didn't completely follow
It's easier to follow in
It's easy
code.
to see. But there's
I fell off after this.
but there's only for any role there's only one class implementing it, and it is either at the node role level, at the bar clamp level, or at the generic level. Now we're back to the same scoping boundaries that we had before. Okay, so this is the major mechanism. So anytime you want to mess with a role, you're going to subclass it. You're going to stick it in the bar clamps engine, and that's how you're going to manage it. And one of the things that we also found out we had to do was when a node is added to the system.
There are a couple of instances where it's good for the roles themselves to notice when nodes are added and removed.
Correct. And so a role can choose to get notified when nodes are added or removed. So DHCP and DNS are really good examples of that. And then jigs have the same behavior. So when a node is created or added, jigs also get notified. So Chef can actually create the node in Chef or delete the node from Chef. Right, and then we would use that if we went back to ServiceNow with this, we could actually come and say, hey, ServiceNow, you have a whole bunch of transactions, you bring in an Excel spreadsheet, you would populate this by the Excel spreadsheet, and then you have to go do a whole bunch of work. Your jig would actually do that work for you, right? So I'll give you a very concrete example. Let's say we had a jig that actually did a system diagnostic check. which is perfectly a reasonable thing to do. So it does an out-of-band system diagnostic check. When a node is added to the system, that jig would actually go and do the system diagnostic check and would start doing the work, and that would kick that thing off to do. Or you might add it as another provisioning tool, or there's all sorts of places. Like you might have an inventory management system, and when a node is added into Crowbar, you'd want to tell the inventory management system, hey, I just added a new node. Those are the types of things that you can do.
How do you register interest in one of the events?
Override.
You subclass role, and then you override this behavior.
So this is why we keep saying they're not events. You don't subscribe to them.
Yes.
These are calls.
These are calls.
They're calls. They're calls. They are.
Okay.
Right. They're calls.
I don't understand what you just said.
Well, right, because a different way to possibly do this would have been actually have an event bus where when some piece of code does something interesting, it actually just throws some sort of a message. Correct.
Have some sort of pump sub setup.
Any kind of subscriber could then just say, you know what, I'm not going to do anything in this code. I got my own code. I'm writing my own language. I don't care. I'm just going to listen. And when this comes across, I want to do something.
I understand.
That's what I was asking.
We haven't demonstrated a need for that, and frankly,
What?
Huh?
He was asking how to do that, and Rob pointed out that's not available.
we don't
Correct.
do that.
That was
Well,
it.
you could create a role that everybody touched, and then
Well,
sub it out if you wanted.
You can create a role that basically listens to everything always and then throws it on.
Yes.
If there is a need, maybe you can post a message in the future.
Well, actually, you could probably create that by going through the null.
It's fine. I just asked.
You could. No,
You
it's
could use a
just
null as a semicolon.
But it's actually those are all reasonable use cases, and we could extend the core engine to broadcast roles or events.
We could extend this to be a pub sub system. It's just until we need it, we ain't gonna do it. Because maintaining pub sub by itself is so a little fun piece of work.
Well,
For that, we'd wind up turning this into Rabbit essentially.
yes, that would have been a reasonable thing to do. I think you act like it's not, but I think it would be.
I'm not saying it's not at all. It was actually where we started. So Greg and Andy were implementing this using Rabbit and event queuing, and Judd actually did some really interesting work on this.
Enough said.
It just wound up, why do we need all this complexity? We don't need that right now. So,
Well,
in the name of actually being able to implement something that works,
I don't think that's complex. I think having a generalized implementation is less complex than having a specialized. But that's just
Maybe.
Okay.
I would accept the argument of somebody saying that we stuck with tools that we were comfortable with, but you can argue whether they were architecturally superior or not. That's a different argument.
the difference is right now I have something that I can actually deploy things with, and earlier we didn't. But anyways, yeah.
Okay, so that's the event system, and then inside of role we end up with a lot of logic. I will let Victor explain cohorts, which I know because I know he was having fun doing that with Wayne, so he's rehearsed.
But I already understood what it's about.
Yeah.
Do we need to explain cohorts at this point? Probably not.
Probably not.
All right, so we will. Good. All right.
It's a boring implementation detail essentially.
Yeah, there is some need to figure out what things go ahead of what things, and cohorts do that. As a matter of fact, I don't want to spend a lot of time digging into it. This is really down into the way down in the details of how Crowbar makes decisions in the orchestration
But that
engine.
function that you're at right there, that's probably the most important function in the entire framework.
Why isn't it us all caps?
Because then it'd be a constant, and
We'd shout it. We'd make the name even longer. That would imply importance. Yeah, this is called a lot. Well, this is called when you take that action when you click the button between role and node. That's actually no.
the reason I say this is the most important function is because everything that this is the function that actually builds the node role graph, and it is what needs to be examined carefully to make sure that the node role graph stays sane for any given combination of flags or implementation choices or whatever that roles have.
Oh, we didn't talk about flags. I knew we forgot something when we were in roles.
Well, we're still in roles.
We're still in roles, so we can talk about flags.
Yeah.
Flags. So somebody should have left the documentation in here. That would have been really useful.
Yeah, it would have, wouldn't it?
No, it wouldn't have. That would have actually been less helpful because that would have not had people actually add to the documentation in these ways.
We need to talk to you about RDoc.
If I thought that was just floating.
And we don't care if you hate it.
I do. And so in the that would have been an interesting way to approach this problem, but I don't think it would have.
Well, it was the original way we were approaching it way back in the day.
Yeah, I know. But it only does part of what I needed. All right. Roll.
The problem is the flags are wrong.
Flags. So we'll talk through what these do, and then we can update the docs.
Well, we need to update them right now.
Okay.
Okay. This library shouldn't exist. No. Just delete library, and then move the header for implicit up to library. Nope. Oh, or you can do it that way if you want.
You want to explain what it is?
So implicit right now. Oh. Yeah, delete that otherwise. And that description is actually all wrong now. Implicit is a flag that says any role that depends on this role must have, or any child in a parent-child role relationship, if a child role requires a parent role on its and it's being bound to a specific node, then that parent role must also be bound to that node.
No, sorry.
Okay.
Noise you heard was that going right over my head.
Concrete example. Damn near everything ultimately relies on having the admin network bound to a server. We don't do that. We don't do that explicitly anywhere. Instead, there are a lot of roles that depend on the network admin role, and when they depend on that role, when we're going through and we're building the graph, we notice, oh hey, we want a DNS client on this box because we want a DNS client on every box. And the DNS client relies on the network admin role, and it's not bound to this node, so we're going to bind it to this node too.
Okay.
That's what the implicit flag means.
All right. Gotcha.
It used to mean more, but now it doesn't.
Okay.
So probably need to rename it to something that's a little more meaningful. More meaningful names are welcome.
Right. The reason why it's called implicit is because Crowbar can take automatic action to install that on the node because it doesn't have to.
That's actually the meaning that.
Original.
That's actually the thing that's not meaningful anymore. Is that Crowbar always takes automatic action right now.
Yes, but it means it can automatically do it to its own node.
Lead with the example.
Okay, I'll do that. Yeah, so ditch that indicates that this role, and that actually is the bootstrap flag description.
Oh.
And the old bootstrap is actually the flag for discovery.
Oh, I got them off by one.
Yep.
Yeah.
And the old one is actually the flag for server.
Yeah, so they're off by one. Buster?
Well, that one was
Correct.
partially correct. I think we had two descriptions there. Yeah. Okay, so I think that's correct-ish now. So
you want to describe them?
Yeah, that's what I was doing. Go back up. Okay, so Bootstrap. We have a set of node roles, or we have a set of roles that we want to be automatically bound to all of the admin, to the first admin node. And when we want that to happen, we just say, give it the Bootstrap flag, and it'll automatically be bound to the admin node. whenever you first deploy the system. And then the role dependency logic that's in will handle binding all of the roles it depends on, and so on and so forth. Actually, right now there's only one role that you need Bootstrap on.
Which is?
Crowbar admin node, and it actually requires all of the other roles, and we let the dependency logic pull them in. Okay. And the next flag is discovery, which is a lot like Bootstrap, except every non-admin node gets all the roles with the discovery flag.
I'm full screen, but I'm not full screen.
You've scrolled in multiple directions there.
All right, sorry. Discovery.
Yeah, so things like there's actually just a single role called Crowbar Manage node that has the discovery flag right now, and all the standard set of roles that we want on all of our nodes are pulled in as dependencies of it. Things like deployer client, NTP client, DNS client, that sort of thing.
Okay. Keep scrolling again.
Yep. And then server. By default, when a node role is run, we shove attribute data into it, and we pull attribute data out. And what the server flag says that any child node roles should get attribute data that we push back out. This flag is probably going to go away when we extend the attribute system to cover inbound and outbound data from the node roles, because then we'll specify it on an attribute by attribute basis.
Cluster.
And cluster is an interesting one. So the thing that drove me to implement the cluster flag was the cephmon service. When we're deploying a ceph cluster, we don't want any of the other ceph, we don't want any of the OSD roles or any of the MBS roles or Rados GW roles to start doing anything until all of the mons are up and running. And if we add a new mon, we want all of the children that were bound to the other mons to also be bound to the new mon.
Sorry, what is a mon?
Monitor.
Ceph monitor.
Yeah.
Well, Ceph, it's a Ceph specific thing.
Yeah, it's a Ceph specific thing. And what this logic says, or whenever a node has the cluster flag, then, or whenever a role has the cluster flag, then any node roles that are created in a deployment, all of the children of those node roles are bound to all of the parents. So like all of the cephmon, like each of the individual cephmons is bound to all of the OSDs, whereas in the normal logic it would just be bound to the OSD on the same node. And all of the OSDs are bound to all of the cephmons.
I'm sorry, what's an OSD?
Storage,
It's out of the
essentially.
Ceph thing. Yep.
It's a Ceph thing. OSD is their term for essentially like an HDFS node in Hadoop.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And that flag tells the essentially tells the logic that builds the graph to make sure that all of the parents and all the children stay fully connected. If you add a new child, it'll be bound to all of the parents, and if you add a new parent, it'll be bound to all the already existing children.
Okay. Cool. Yay, progress.
Okay. So does that make sense what I was saying?
This is one of those cases where we really want people as they learn this to oops, I don't need to be here, to come back and add to the documentation and help clarify. Hey, this flag means this, because these have a lot of consequences, and it's important to understand what's going on. Is library actually gone?
I've never found anything that actually used it.
No, I think what you did was implicit. The idea was that, like, the rationale for having it was if you had Oslo as a role where OpenStack had an underlying thing, you would flag it as a library, and then you would know to expect it to be a required thing. So implicit probably is duplicate.
Yeah.
At this point.
They pretty much mean the same thing at this point, I think.
Yeah,
but I've been using implicit for all of that.
There's a weird question of whether the idea with library is that it had to be on your node, not that it could be. So I think implicit now is doing the same thing. So there's a weird thing of saying, hey, I have a dependency that could be implemented anywhere in the system, which is one, I guess, without flags.
Well, anywhere in either the deployment or any of my parent deployments.
Right. So by default, you'll get that behavior. If you use implicit, you'll say, hey, this needs to be on my node specifically. That's originally what I thought for library.
Yeah.
So we should probably remove that. Okay. Wow. All right. So we've talked about roles quite a bit. I was going to jump into jigs because that is of interest also.
Yeah, if you go into models and then into Barclamp Crowbar,
yay.
There's our script jig.
Okay. Right. So we always have the Barclamp model, by the way. It doesn't do anything. It's needed for engine. I believe it's needed for the engine. And this is the script jig. So in this case, the Crowbar jig, these are created when in database migrations. So they're actually, you add a jig during import as part of adding. All you have to do to create a jig is to add it to the jig table. So technically you could actually do a jig late bound if you wanted.
So you would do it in a migration?
The jigs are added during migrations because they're database. They're effectively database entries because they're class overrides. So there is a jig base class. Let me bring it up.
Well, we technically don't need to do it that way. Like I've got the no-op jig. You've just implemented as class no-op jig.
They're derived classes.
Yes. So let me bring that up. The actual jig class is almost nothing in it. It's just stubs.
Yeah. If you scroll all the way down to the bottom of that.
Oh yeah, you put the no-op jig right here.
The no-op jig right there.
That's true.
That's the world's simplest jig.
Yeah.
It just sets you to active. No data.
Nothing to stage.
Active.
And it always just sets the nodal state to active.
Sign me up for that.
And
that's
then
why I said the no-op jig.
We've tried, just like everything else, we're using overrides. So we just provide stubs so you can see what the expected overrides are. Right, and then so the jig does it generically and then calls all that. This is actually some code that Andy wrote.
So how do you describe the jig? Is that
Well, scroll all the way back down to the bottom again.
is that just a class?
Jig is just a class, yeah. And the jig's entire purpose in life is to first figure out what data needs to be, or what attributes need to be, what attributes should be present for a jig run on the node, and then actually do it once it's time to run it.
So it's basically just a local orchestration.
Yeah, it's an interface. It's an abstraction for the CMDB.
Yeah.
It's for the config. So it's a Puppet or Chef. It's an abstraction layer. But it's really anything that needs to do X work in Crowbar is done by a jig. Crowbar does no work. It just orchestrates work. It's the supervisor of the highway crew.
Yeah.
But it's an interface. Somebody has to implement it.
Correct. Yeah, and stage run and run are the minimal implementations. There's really not much more than that, because beyond this, the only you get you can be told when nodes are created or destroyed.
If you don't care about that, then you don't have to deal with
no
it.
other action. So
yeah, like if we back out of here and actually go to the script jig.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
it's got a couple of helper methods to do SCP and SSH.
Mm-hmm.
And stage run on this doesn't have to do anything complex, so it just asks the node role for all the data that it needs to do a transition. And run just gets handed the node role and the blob of data that stage run returned, and figures out what attributes it needs, creates a little directory hierarchy that encapsulates all of them, finds all the scripts that it needs to do things, and puts that in the same directory hierarchy, SCPs the whole thing over to the node, runs it, captures any changed attributes, or SCPs it all back, figures out what the changed attributes are, and updates the wall.
Right. There's actually an expectation of mine that people are going to start using the script jig actually as a hammer, just to get things done. Because frankly, if I don't want to deal with Chef, I can just brute force, use the script jig, SSH in, act on something, and then be done.
Yeah.
So if I have SSH access, script jig is sufficient to do it. So you could actually use this to configure switches, per se. If you were to use
depending
the
on switch
SSH
models, we
interface.
might want to write jigs that do things more elegantly for them. But if we just need a brute force method of doing it, then
Right. That is, we should have called it a brute force jig. No,
BFJ.
that would have made it, actually, people would have wanted to use it. The script jig actually sounds vaguely unattractive.
Yeah.
Yes, clawhammer was the original name for jig.
What was it? What was the original name?
Clawhammer.
So when Judd originally proposed this architecture, he had suggested the name clawhammer, and that we didn't have the prescience to appreciate his vision at the time. This was the original Crowbar 1. The first pass at Crowbar was Judd had suggested this, and it made a lot of sense.
Is this the recommended way to get things done?
For scripting, for the script jig?
For very simple things which you don't want to bother doing through Chef. Yeah.
So remember, our chef work is actually also done through SSH.
Well, go ahead and bring up the Chef Bark map, or the Chef Bark map.
Can do it.
Yeah, and go into the script directory.
Mm-hmm.
There's our roles there, and this is how we install a Chef server. It's just a script that's handled through the script.
So can you describe in one sentence what one uses a Chef jig for versus any other kind of jig?
The chef or script?
Chef.
The chef. The chef.
When should one use a Chef jig?
When you don't want to care about making all of your scripts idempotent, or when there's already a handy Chef cookbook out there that does what you want, and you just want to wrap it.
So it's not restricted to installing things on nodes?
No.
Why?
Because the chef can do a hell of a lot more than just installing things on nodes.
Well, isn't that how we got in trouble in the first place?
It's not trouble that we got into.
Using Chef for things
What we
beyond
got-
its intended
well, what we got-
got us in trouble.
No, but Chef isn't just in installing things on nodes. What got us into trouble is we were using Chef as our backing store for freaking Crowbar.
Yeah.
And we're not doing that anymore.
Right.
We're letting
That
Chef
we're
do
not
its own
doing.
thing.
Well, okay, so I'm just saying for everybody else, it seems like some guidance as to when to use Chef versus when to use Script versus when to use other things. When to use
That's why I asked the question. I asked it.
Oh.
I didn't ask it as directly as you did, which is what would be a best practice.
Oh,
Because
okay.
the other
Whichever is
thing
handy.
Chef offers is cross-platform. It's even across different versions of Starnixes. And when we're seeing things like sudo's actually sitting there, sudo semantics are not supported on all versions of Linux.
That's right.
So,
But they're supported on all the ones we care about.
So hold on.
okay, I just want to be clear though. That's another great benefit.
The script jig could have been named jig of last resort.
Yeah.
It's and that is the use case for using the script jig is when you don't have access to a real jig. The goal is to be able to use the chef jig or the puppet jig or a chef solo jig or
The main use case for writing the script jig was to not have to have special case in the install for everything to install Chef.
correct.
Like if
Yeah,
you,
but I'm not so concerned about the Script jig as the Chef jig.
So
Well,
you would
something
use
you
the
can turn
chef
off the chef
jig
jig.
if you had a cookbook to do a deployment, you wanted to take advantage of that.
So it's deployments.
Yes, installation, configuration, and setup.
So if I want to turn off a machine, I wouldn't use the Script jig.
Oh, that's a good question. So we're about to face that question when we
you're going to get to
implement-
solve that problem. Congratulations. You'll probably have to write your own IPMI jig to do that.
I don't know. Yeah, so the IPMI. So Wayne's asking because the IPMI bar clamp will have to reach outside of the Crowbar context to turn things on and off. We cheated before when we did that, and it'll probably end up needing to be a jig. It'll probably need to be a jig. I don't know.
Okay.
That's a good question.
And it could be a jig that leverages the script jig to do its job, or if you feel adventurous, it could be a jig that directly goes out and pokes the IPMI interface directly using IPMI tool or whatever.
I'm not even, but I'm almost thinking it's an out of band thing. That we just do what we did before, and if you exit that there's code in the IPMI bar clamp that just executes
Yeah,
from the
because
server.
I just recently learned about all the machinations that were involved in how not being my
Oh, the IPMI bar clamp, those are some fugly chef recipes, let me tell you.
So the good news is that chef
unfortunately,
recipes
that's
are
kind
going
of because IPMI is kind of fundamentally fugly.
So
Okay, well, let's move on.
yes,
Yeah.
I actually suspect you're just going to poke like we do now, just poke a REST call out from the web server and assume that you have access.
Well, for WSMan, that's perfectly cromulent, but if you don't have that, then you have to deal with IPMI tool and whether you want to run it on the client or the server and assume you have network safety. Yeah.
Right.
All that fun stuff.
Which is painful, especially if you're on Windows.
Yeah. Yes, it is.
So the chef bar clamp actually has no roles for chef, which if you think about it makes a lot of sense. And then inside of the bar clamp itself, there's not much here, but there is the jig. So the jig is going to be in the models, bar clamp, and then there's a jig. So this jig is the override for the jig. So bar clamp chef jig. So when it creates the jig table, this is what it puts this model in. And then when it names it chef, and then whenever you link those things together in the in the Crowbar YAML for the roles, you're connecting it to what gets created here.
Right now, the cookbooks and roles are loaded on demand. I don't want to have that established as the long-term pattern. I did that because it was expedient to do so there.
Could you show us the base jig?
Yep.
And it lives in the bar plant, our bar.
Yeah, the base jig is just in the framework. So this is a little bit confusing.
Yeah, that's just a class that everything else,
Right.
all the other jigs need to inherit from.
So because we sort of merge in the concept of the framework is also a bar clamp, there are things that are implemented in the bar clamp crowbar namespace inside the framework, which is so. These things here, the jig, and then some default attributes are actually namespaced as bar clamp crowbar, because we still have that conceptual boundary. And then things in the top level directory are namespaced to the main application. And actually, main app is actually useful because the engines use that.
So when you create the bar clamp, all this gets packaged automatically, and then you add your additional stuff.
Right. With all the bar clamps are added in as effectively as engines, so they not literally as Rails engines. And so
they do the same thing.
Yep. Well, Crowbar 1 didn't do it. It just all kind of got smashed together in the same framework directory.
Yes. We didn't, and one of the big innovations for Crowbar 2 was to use Rails in a much more sane way. And engines was one of the ways we did that, by the rules.
To the extent that Rails can be considered sane.
Yes. Well, we followed the Rails insanities that Rails wanted us to follow. Much more. So we use engines, and it creates nice scoping boundaries. The only thing that you'll note is that if you're used to Crowbar 1, where we basically had one giant namespace we overlaid everything on top of, the bar clamps actually stay they have more deeply nested paths because they're in Rails namespaces. The other thing you'll notice if you go poking at the server is that the engines are not actually copied in anymore. One of the things that we did was that we actually link the engines in and don't recopy them. So there isn't this, hey, my bar clamp's in one place, but I made copies of it over here someplace else. So one of the things that's confusing if you're troubleshooting and you are working on a engine, like network, I do on the network all the time, like changing the UI on the network stuff, you change it, if you're changing it on the server, you're changing it in the bar clamps directory, not in the Crowbar framework directory. Crowbar framework actually links all of those. They leave it in place and link the bar clamp.
By horribly abusing gem semantics.
Well, and something to keep in mind too is Crowbar 2 you can actually use modern IDEs on as it's structured now, and they understand the engine business and all that. But as we change repository structures, we need to be careful not to break that capability.
Yeah.
Can we still use IDEs on this?
Yes. Wayne will help you there. Because he uses a different IDE than I do.
Emacs.
Emacs
he uses an IDE.
Wayne is a Chuck Norris IDE.
I'm using a very Unixy IDE, with the exception of Emacs.
But Wayne was the architect behind our engines change out, so he actually understands the mechanics of how the engines work really well.
More than any of us. Congratulations.
He understands it best.
It's a comparison.
Story points. All right. We are within 5 minutes of timeout. We've covered a lot of material way down in the weeds. We did not do the one thing that we had said we were going to do, which is walk through the frame. And actually what I would suggest we do, unless we have a pressing question, is spend the last 5 minutes doing that and walking through the objects that you would hit in a discovery path. Okay, which I can do. So what happens when you come in? So we've simplified the node bring up quite a bit. So when a node is added into the system, it pixie boots. When it pixie boots the first time, we don't know anything about it, and so we give it the sledgehammer image. Okay, and the sledgehammer image brings up a minimal OS, and then infers from that, from its DHCP entries, where to go ask for information about the admin server. It uses that information to bring over a script file called control.sh, which in Crowbar 2 is built for it. You want to describe that?
Bring it up.
Okay.
Because it's much simpler than it used to be.
Oh, it's in Provisioner.
Yeah, it's in the Provisioner.
Sorry, I didn't mean to stop sharing. I clicked the wrong button.
Hey Rob, this is Kurt. I got to drop, but I got 2.0 installed in my environment
awesome.
in our lab. Is there sometime you could take us testers just through a walkthrough of the UI, because it's not as intuitive as what we would think.
Yeah, we can do another training session for that. I think that makes a lot of sense.
Okay.
And that'll let you guys give feedback to make it more intuitive.
Okay. Yeah, I got the admin node up and one additional node, so I'll just leave it from that point. And go from there. So I'll get with you Monday.
I'm out of town Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, but how about Thursday when I get back? Or somebody else, actually Victor or somebody else can walk you through that.
Yeah, I can walk you through it.
You're going to want me to be, so I can help you with the UI changes. Why don't you work with Victor and collect suggestions for the UI, and then I'll work with you when I get back.
Okay. Victor, I'll set a meeting invite, and I'll have Audra and John and Tony, whoever else wants to come.
Okay.
All right. Thanks. Thanks, Rob. Good job.
No worries. Thanks.
Control.sh.erb.
So C. Yeah, the screen's hard to read. All right. Victor.
Oh, scroll down too much. Okay, there we go.
So control.sh.
Yep.
Template.
So we assume that we know what MAC address we booted from, what boot device we booted off of, what the admin IP is, domain, all that other fun stuff. We get that from the actual startup.sh that runs, that's actually baked into the sledgehammer image. So first thing we do in control, you scroll down too far. I'll tell you when to scroll down.
Okay.
First thing we do is we make sure that we are running off of the version of control.sh that's in the temp directory, which was copied over as the last thing that startup.sh did. Because if we're not, hilarity will ensue when we try to unmount the NFS file system in not too much longer. Once we've done that, do a bit of logging, export any, or if we are using a proxy, we figure out what that is, export it. We get past the provisioner that we're using and the IP address of the provisioner. That actually gets filled out as part of the template, so that'll all be correct when Sledgehammer starts executing it. We figure out if we were passed in a host name as on the kernel command line, then we know we're already registered. If we aren't, then we'll need to register ourselves. So we
Registered with the admin node?
Registered with Crowbar.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, this host name is your own name.
Yeah.
Your node's name.
Yeah. And on the admin side, the way that works is we write out node-specific pixie config and elilo config files for each host, and they contain the host name. And so if it's not registered, it just gets the generic one that doesn't contain the host name. And that's how we tell.
So this script gets run in more cases than just this is the first time that the nodes come up?
This script gets run every time a node boots into Sledgehammer.
Boots into Sledgehammer.
Yeah. This is the we booted into Sledgehammer, what do we do next
That's what I
script.
thought.
Yeah.
But so why would it be already registered?
Because you wanted to update the BIOS. Because you wanted to reset it, because you wanted to boot it into debug
You would have
mode
been registered first time.
screw around with it, because you wanted to zap the hard drives, whatever.
Okay, gotcha.
Lots of different reasons to boot back into Sledgehammer. So we set our host name correctly, then, oh, you are, Okay. Then if we need to create an entry for ourselves in Crowbar, we do that. Hit it up with curl and say, hey, I'm a new node. And by the time that call returns, the node will have been created and all of its default node roles bound to it.
Which is the next
Question.
thing to drill into.
Mm-hmm.
You said this registers it with Crowbar?
Mm-hmm.
If it didn't have a host name, will it register it?
If it doesn't have a host name, that's the only time it registers with it. If it does have a host name, then it won't register. And by has a host name, I mean was a host name passed in as a kernel parameter.
Indeed.
Right. That's what I was meaning. Okay, forget it. We register everything in the subject. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Chicken and egg.
Yeah. And if we were already registered, then instead we post back to Crowbar saying, I'm booting into Sledgehammer. That way Crowbar knows what boot environment it's booting into and can adjust its PXE config as appropriate. Next thing we do is we unmount the NFS stuff because we're about to rewrite our networking config. We figure out we ask Crowbar what IP addresses we should have, because by the time we get here, whether it's a new node or not, the IP addresses on the admin range have been allocated. So we get those addresses back, kill DH client, flush all of our old addresses, bind to the new ones onto the Ethernet device we booted from. Create our resolve comp.
At this point, I'm assuming that at this point logging is occurring on the node itself. At some point, does this logging get transferred back up to the admin node for us to use?
Not at this point, and you'll see why very shortly.
Okay.
We create our resolve conf, populate it with the right things, make sure that everything's using our local, make sure, zap any host stuff that was in Etsy host, so we're forcing DNS reliance to look everything up. We ping the DNS server with our host name until we return a valid lookup. That'll let us, and that mechanism lets us know that DNS has registered us, and we can resolve names correctly. Once we can resolve names, synchronize NTP, set up our local gmRCs, install the basic stuff that we need, suck down Chef and install it, set up our SSH keys and our SSH permissions, post back to Crowbar saying we're alive now, you can do stuff with us, and exit.
Install Chef?
On that NTP date command, you should throw a -u on it.
Yeah, I probably should.
And at the point we exit, what is the state of the node? It's still running Sledgehammer?
Yeah, it's still running Sledgehammer. It's alive.
It's registered.
It's registered. We can SSH into it.
What's the name of the script again? Is it control.sh?
Yep.
It's the template, so it's a template version of control.sh.
It's a template version. It gets customized.
And the initiation of the script is caused by Crowbar.
Whenever a Sledgehammer boots, control.sh will eventually be run.
So it's changed. Is that right?
It's always acted that way.
When Sledgehammer starts up, it sits in the startup script waiting for the transition state to turn.
That was all handled through control.sh. That's always been handled through control.sh. All startup.sh did was figure out what we booted from and figure out enough to mount the NFS file systems to copy control.sh down.
But I think Wayne is right. Wayne is right.
No, control.sh went into the wait loop.
Yes, Wayne. In the sequence that happened, Crowbar 1, you went through and ultimately ended up in a wait loop.
That's what I'm asking.
And control.sh put you in that. The old control.sh put you in that loop. The new control.sh doesn't. It tells the system that it's ready and then waits, and then we push to it rather than get pulled.
Okay, so at this point, the only thing that's happened to the node is absolutely nothing. It's just that we have created the node within Crowbar and verified that Crowbar is working with it.
Yes, we've
to some point by pinging it.
Well, by getting its IP address back.
Yeah, we get its IP address back. We verify that DNS is caught up, and we can resolve ourselves and by extension everything else in Crowbar. And we've set up SSH and marked ourselves as alive, and that's what Crowbar needs to know to be able to do stuff with it.
Right. Okay.
And from there, the framework takes over. There's no more wait loops. There's no more dicking around with poking transitions or anything like that.
I'm assuming that there's a way to put these into debug mode at some point.
That would be a function of how you're booting it into Sledgehammer. Because it's the way it's running right now, it's kind of always in debug mode. If Sledgehammer doesn't have anything to do with it, it'll just sit there forever.
Well, I mean, I guess, Randy, part of this is that we're doing a lot less in this. So a lot of the debug that you would want to do would happen.
Yeah,
would happen actually when Crowbar starts SSHing into the box and doing things.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the debug mode stuff that we had in the old Sledgehammer happened because Control.sh had essentially its own little state machine baked into it, and debug mode essentially just bypassed all that crap. And now there's nothing to bypass.
Okay, I'm just running through my mind why because I use debug quite a bit, and I'm trying to think of why I'm using it quite a bit, and so I have to think about that before in saying that I need it or not, and I need to document what I'm using it for.
Well, I mean, the equivalent of debug mode in Sledgehammer in Crowbar 2 would just be booting it up and having nothing else to do.
Right, but right now we can take an active node and move it to debug mode, and that's really the question I have. Is there a way to take an active node that's already been completely done by Sledgehammer and move it over to debug mode still?
Right now, the way you would do that is you would post an API call back to Sledgehammer or back to Crowbar that set its boot environment to Sledgehammer, and then reboot the node, and then it would just boot up, do this, and stop.
So there is a way. Okay.
Yeah. It's not formalized yet, but there is a way to do it.
That'll be more formalized once we can change the. We do the multi-OS work.
Yeah.
We'll actually have that come in because that's really where that comes from.
Right. That's fine. Just as long as we have a way, because the main reason I would use it is to get in to verify hard drives, or if we were seeing some weird hardware issue.
Yeah, and I would love for one of these alternate environments to also actually be a diagnostic image. I think that would be pretty powerful, and then you could boot into a diagnostic image.
Yeah.
That would be good too.
Well, the way we would do that in this would just we'd have a diagnostic image role that essentially boot into Sledgehammer, sucked on all the diagnostic things you needed to run them.
Yeah, that would be more. That'd be really cool.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. So we are at the end. We are 10 minutes over. I'm happy to go another couple minutes and walk through the rest of this node process, but I suspect people are fried. And so.
Friday.
It's Friday. It's 5 o'clock. East Coast is ready for a beer.
So we're going to call it a day. We clearly need more training sessions. We will continue to do these. I think the next one, there's 2 on tap right now. One of them is to walk through the whole progress of a node install and talk about the methods.
I'll try to bring that mail that I sent out a few months ago up to date.
We'll document that, and if we don't do it in the next 3 days since I'm traveling, we'll start Thursday and Friday of next week again. And then people are going to start forgetting stuff because of Thanksgiving. We're also going to do a QA walkthrough of the UI so that QA can understand the workflows and then start making asks on how to improve the UI in order to help make things more intuitive. Right, you're not going to hurt our feelings. We know this is a dev focused UI right now, and we need to make improvements.
Yeah.
Yep. All right, everybody. Thank you. Have a great weekend.
Thanks. So Victor, have a good weekend. Install fair.